What happens when one of television's most beloved figures comes face to face with a host who seems determined to tear her down? You won't believe what unfolds when Oprah Winfrey sits across from Jimmy Kimmel in what was supposed to be a light-hearted, late-night appearance, only to witness one of the most explosive confrontations in talk show history. The tension that builds throughout their conversation reaches a breaking point that leaves viewers stunned and social media in complete chaos. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when America's most trusted voice meets a host who clearly had an agenda from the moment she walked onto his stage. The atmosphere in the Jimmy Kimmel Live studio felt different from the moment Oprah Winfrey made her entrance. What should have been a warm welcome for one of media's most respected figures instead carried an undercurrent of tension that seemed to emanate directly from the host himself. Kimmel's usual animated greeting appeared forced, his smile not quite reaching his eyes as he introduced the woman who had built an empire on authenticity and compassion. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the one and only Oprah Winfrey," Kimmel announced. But even his audience seemed to pick up on something off in his delivery. The applause was thunderous as always for Oprah, but keen observers noticed how Kimmel's body language remained stiff, almost defensive, as she took her seat. Oprah, radiant in a deep purple ensemble that seemed to command respect, settled into the guest chair with her characteristic grace. Her warm smile and genuine enthusiasm for being there stood in stark contrast to her host's barely concealed agitation. She thanked the audience graciously, waving to fans who were clearly thrilled to see her in person, but Kimmel wasted no time cutting through the pleasantries. "So, Oprah, you've been making headlines lately," he began, his tone already carrying an edge that caught both his guest and the studio audience off guard. "Some people are saying you've lost touch with regular Americans. What's your response to that?" The question hung in the air like a challenge thrown down at a duel. Oprah's eyebrows raised slightly, not in surprise but in the measured way of someone who recognizes they're being set up for something unpleasant. The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that this wasn't going to be the typical celebrity chat they'd expected. "I think that's an interesting perspective, Jimmy," Oprah replied, her voice maintaining its trademark warmth despite the obvious provocation. "I've spent my entire career connecting with people from all walks of life. My show, my network, my philanthropic work. It's all been about understanding and uplifting the human experience in all its forms." But Kimmel wasn't satisfied with her diplomatic response. He leaned forward in his chair, his expression hardening as he pressed further. "Come on, Oprah. You're worth billions of dollars. You live in multiple mansions. When was the last time you actually struggled to pay a bill or worried about putting food on the table? How can you claim to understand what regular people are going through?" The studio fell into an uncomfortable silence. Even the camera operators seemed to sense that something was going very wrong very quickly. This wasn't the playful ribbing that late-night hosts were known for. This felt personal, almost vindictive. Oprah's composure remained intact, but those who knew how to read her could see the steel beginning to form behind her eyes. "Jimmy, I think you're operating under some misconceptions about who I am and where I come from," she said, her voice still controlled but carrying a new undertone of warning. "I was born into poverty in rural Mississippi. I know what it means to go hungry, to feel powerless, to face discrimination. Success doesn't erase your past or make you forget where you came from." The host's response was swift and cutting. "But it sure makes it easier to preach from your ivory tower, doesn't it? You tell people to think positive thoughts while you're sitting on a fortune that most Americans could never dream of. Some might call that hypocritical." A collective gasp rippled through the studio audience. This had crossed a line that even seasoned late-night viewers weren't accustomed to seeing crossed. Oprah's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the arms of her chair, and for the first time since sitting down, her smile faltered completely. The woman who had faced down controversial interviews, difficult guests, and public scrutiny for decades was clearly being pushed toward a breaking point that no one in that studio was prepared to witness. "I'm sorry, but I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about why I'm here tonight," Oprah said, her voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level that anyone who had worked with her would recognize as a storm warning. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as America's most beloved television personality began to show cracks in her legendary composure, and it became clear that Jimmy Kimmel had severely underestimated exactly who he was, trying to tear down on national television. But instead of backing down or recognizing the warning signs that were flashing like neon lights in front of him, Kimmel doubled down with a smirk that would haunt his career for months to come. "Oh, I think I understand perfectly, Oprah. You're here to promote your latest project, sell some books, make some money. Same as every other celebrity who sits in that chair. The difference is, most of them don't pretend to be saints while they're doing it." The studio audience had gone from uncomfortable shifting to complete silence. Even the production crew behind the cameras had stopped their usual bustling activity, sensing they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years. Oprah's publicist, visible in the wings, looked like she was ready to storm onto the set and end this disaster before it got any worse. "Saints," Oprah repeated, her voice gaining strength and edge with each word. "Jimmy, I've never claimed to be perfect, and I've certainly never claimed to be a saint. What I have done is dedicate my life to using whatever platform I've been given to lift others up, to create opportunities for people who look like me, who come from where I come from. If you see that as somehow fraudulent or hypocritical, then perhaps the problem isn't with me." Kimmel's response was swift and vicious. "Lift people up? Is that what you call it when you charge people hundreds of dollars to attend your speaking events? When you sell them overpriced wellness products and tell them it's going to change their lives? You've turned hope into a commodity, Oprah. You've monetized inspiration." The accusation hit the studio like a physical blow. Several audience members audibly gasped, while others began looking around as if searching for the nearest exit. This had gone far beyond uncomfortable. It had entered territory that felt genuinely dangerous to witness. Oprah's hands, which had been resting calmly on the chair arms, slowly clenched into fists. "How dare you," she said, her voice no longer carrying any pretense of media-trained politeness. "How dare you sit there and diminish the work I've done, the lives I've touched, the barriers I've broken down? Do you have any idea what it took for a black woman from Mississippi to build what I've built? The doors that were slammed in my face? The people who told me I wasn't good enough, smart enough, the right color, the right size?" But Kimmel wasn't finished with his assault. If anything, her emotional response seemed to fuel his aggression. "And now you slam those same doors on other people by making success seem like it's just about positive thinking and buying the right products. You've convinced millions of people that if they're not successful, if they're not happy, it's their own fault for not thinking positively enough. That's not inspiration, Oprah. That's manipulation." The confrontation had reached a critical mass that everyone in the studio could feel building toward an explosion. Oprah rose partially from her chair, her composure finally beginning to crack in a way that no one had ever seen before on national television. The woman who had maintained her grace through decades of public scrutiny, personal attacks, and media storms was being pushed to a breaking point that threatened to shatter her carefully maintained public image. "You want to talk about manipulation, Jimmy?" she said, her voice rising for the first time since the interview began. "Let's talk about what you're doing right here, right now. This isn't journalism. This isn't entertainment. This is a deliberate attempt to tear down someone who has spent their entire career trying to build others up. And for what? Ratings? Social media buzz? To make yourself feel bigger by making me feel smaller?" The audience was now completely silent, hanging on every word of what had become less of an interview and more of a verbal battlefield. Camera operators zoomed in, capturing every micro-expression, every gesture, knowing they were documenting. Television history in the making. Kimmel's producers in the control room were frantically debating whether to cut to commercial, but the car crash nature of what they were witnessing made it impossible to look away. "Maybe I'm doing what someone should have done years ago," Kimmel shot back, his voice dripping with contempt. "Maybe it's time someone called out the Oprah machine for what it really is. A business built on selling false hope to desperate people. You've made billions telling people their problems can be solved with the right attitude and the right purchases from your carefully curated list of recommendations." The accusation was so pointed, so personal, and so calculated to wound that it seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the room. Oprah stood fully now, her entire body radiating an energy that everyone present could feel, but no one quite knew how to interpret. This was uncharted territory for everyone involved, and the sense that something irreversible was about to happen hung in the air like smoke before a fire. "You know what, Jimmy?" Oprah said, her voice now carrying a power that seemed to fill every corner of the studio. "I've sat through a lot of interviews in my time. I've been challenged, criticized, and questioned by some of the most aggressive journalists in the world. But never, and I mean never, have I encountered someone so small, so petty, and so desperate for relevance that they would attack someone's life's work just to get a reaction." Kimmel's face flushed red, but instead of backing down, he seemed to take her words as a personal challenge. "Small? Petty? I'm asking the questions that your adoring fans are too starstruck to ask. I'm doing what real journalists should have been doing for years instead of giving you softball interviews and letting you control the narrative." "Control the narrative?" Oprah's laugh was sharp and humorless, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Is that what you think this is about? You think I came here tonight to control some narrative? I came here as a courtesy, Jimmy. I came here because I believed in showing respect for your platform, your audience. I came here because I thought we could have a real conversation about real issues. Instead, you've turned this into some kind of personal vendetta." The studio crew was now openly staring, their professional facade completely abandoned, as they watched two media titans engage in what could only be described as warfare. Kimmel's band members sat frozen at their instruments, unsure whether they should be ready to play or ready to call security. The audience seemed to be holding its collective breath, afraid that even the slightest sound might trigger an even bigger explosion. "Personal vendetta?" Kimmel scoffed, but there was something desperate creeping into his voice now, as if he was beginning to realize he had awakened something far more powerful than he had anticipated. "This is about accountability, Oprah. This is about someone finally having the courage to ask why you get to be above criticism just because you're Oprah Winfrey." "Above criticism?" Oprah's voice rose to a level that no one in that studio had ever heard from her before. "I have been criticized my entire career. I've been called too emotional, too loud, too black, too fat, too successful, too everything. I've had my personal life dissected, my business decisions questioned, my motives analyzed by people who don't know the first thing about who I am or what I've been through. But you know what the difference is between real criticism and what you're doing right now?" She took a step closer to his desk, her presence seeming to tower over him despite their physical positions. "Real criticism comes from a place of wanting to understand, wanting to improve, wanting to engage in meaningful dialogue. What you're doing is character assassination disguised as journalism, and it's beneath both of us." Kimmel, perhaps sensing that he was losing control of the situation, made one final devastating attempt to regain the upper hand. "Maybe the real problem is that you can't handle being treated like everyone else instead of being worshipped like some kind of media goddess. Maybe for once in your pampered, privileged life, you're being forced to answer tough questions instead of being surrounded by yes men and sycophants." The words hit their target with surgical precision. Something in Oprah's expression shifted, fundamentally transforming from anger to something far more dangerous, complete and utter disgust. The studio fell into a silence so profound that the hum of the air conditioning became audible. Even the camera operators seemed to be holding their breath, recognizing that they were capturing a moment that would define both of their careers, in very different ways. "Pampered?" Oprah said, her voice now barely above a whisper but somehow more commanding than when she had been shouting. "Privileged. Let me tell you about privilege, Jimmy. Privilege is being able to sit behind that desk night after night and tear people down without consequence. Privilege is being able to attack someone's character, their life's work, their very essence, and call it entertainment. Privilege is never having to worry that every mistake you make, every word you say, every decision you make will be seen as a reflection on your entire race, your entire gender, your entire community." She began gathering her belongings, her movements, deliberate and final. "I have spent 40 years in this business, earning respect through hard work, integrity, and a genuine commitment to making people's lives better. I don't need to sit here and let someone who has never walked in my shoes, never faced my challenges, never carried my responsibilities, reduce everything I've accomplished to some kind of con game." Kimmel, realizing that his guest was preparing to leave, made one last desperate attempt to maintain control. "So that's it? You're just going to run away when things get a little challenging? I thought the great Oprah Winfrey was tougher than that." The provocation was his final mistake. Oprah turned back to face him with an expression that would be replayed on social media millions of times in the hours that followed. "Challenging? Jimmy, you have no idea what challenging looks like. This isn't challenging. This is pathetic. And I refuse to be part of whatever sick entertainment you think you're providing at my expense." With those words, something fundamental shifted in the studio. The audience, who had been silent spectators to this unprecedented breakdown of television decorum, began to murmur among themselves. Some were pulling out their phones, others were looking toward the exits, and a few were actually applauding Oprah's defiant stance. The power dynamic that Kimmel had tried so desperately to control was now completely in her hands. "You know what the real tragedy is here, Jimmy?" Oprah continued, her voice now carrying the weight of decades of experience and wisdom. "You had an opportunity tonight to have a real conversation with someone who has genuinely tried to make a difference in this world. You could have asked about my schools in South Africa, my leadership academy, the thousands of young women whose lives have been transformed through education. You could have talked about the conversations we need to have about race, about inequality, about the real challenges facing our communities." She gestured toward the audience, her voice rising with passion. "You could have used this platform to inspire, to educate, to bring people together. Instead, you chose to tear down, to divide, to create conflict for the sake of ratings. And that says everything about who you are as a person and nothing about who I am." Kimmel, clearly rattled by the complete loss of control over his own show, made one final desperate attempt to regain the upper hand. "Oh, spare me the sanctimonious speech, Oprah. You're not a saint. You're not a savior. You're just another celebrity who can't handle being called out on your—" "Stop!" The single word from Oprah cut through his tirade like a knife. The authority in her voice was so complete, so final, that Kimmel actually stopped mid-sentence. "Just stop. You've said enough. You've shown everyone exactly who you are tonight, and I think that's punishment enough." She turned to address the studio audience directly, her voice softening but losing none of its power. "I want to apologize to all of you who came here tonight expecting to see something uplifting, something entertaining in the best sense of the word. You deserved better than this. You deserved a host who understood that with great platform comes great responsibility." The audience erupted in spontaneous applause, many of them rising to their feet. The sound was deafening, a clear indication of where their sympathies lay. Kimmel sat behind his desk, his face flushed with embarrassment and rage, but clearly understanding that any attempt to speak over the applause would only make things worse for him. And to anyone watching at home, Oprah continued, raising her voice over the applause, remember that you don't have to accept disrespect disguised as entertainment. You don't have to support media that tears people down instead of building them up. You have the power to choose what you watch, what you support, and what kind of world you want to live in. With that, she turned away from Kimmel completely, as if he no longer existed, and began walking toward the edge of the stage. Her publicist met her there, along with her security detail, all of them clearly relieved that she was finally leaving this toxic environment. The cameras followed her every step, capturing what would become one of the most iconic exits in television history. But Oprah wasn't quite finished. Just before reaching the stage exit, she turned back one final time, not to Kimmel, but to the audience and the cameras. "I've learned a lot of things in my 40 years in this business," she said, her voice carrying across the now silent studio. "I've learned that how you treat people when you have power says everything about your character. I've learned that real strength isn't about tearing others down. It's about lifting them up. And I've learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away from people who are determined to bring out the worst in themselves and everyone around them." The audience erupted again, this time in a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever. People were cheering, crying, some were recording everything on their phones. The energy in the room had completely transformed from the toxic atmosphere Kimmel had created to something resembling a revival meeting, with Oprah as both the preacher and the congregation's salvation. As she finally disappeared backstage, the cameras turned back to Kimmel, who sat alone at his desk looking smaller than anyone had ever seen him. The show's producers were frantically trying to figure out how to salvage what was left of the broadcast, but the damage was done. The audience was still applauding, still standing, still clearly showing their support for the woman who had just walked out on their host. Kimmel attempted to address the audience, to regain some semblance of control over his own show, but his words were drowned out by the continuing applause. When he finally managed to call for a commercial break, his voice was barely audible over the noise. As the cameras cut away, viewers at home were left with the image of a host who had been completely and utterly destroyed by his own arrogance and cruelty. Within hours, the confrontation was trending on every social media platform, with "Respect Oprah" and "Kimmel is over" dominating the conversation. The clip of Oprah's final speech had been viewed millions of times, while Kimmel faced widespread condemnation from celebrities, journalists, and ordinary viewers alike. His ratings plummeted in the following weeks, and several major advertisers pulled their sponsorship from his show. The incident became a defining moment in television history, a perfect example of what happens when hubris meets genuine power, when pettiness confronts dignity, and when someone finally says, "Enough is enough." Oprah Winfrey had walked into that studio as a guest and walked out as a legend, leaving behind a host whose career would never fully recover from the night he decided to take on a force far greater than himself.